By the time the case reached a federal courtroom, the damage had already spread far beyond one man, one company, or one scandal. This was no longer just a criminal trial. It was a threat to an empire built on spectacle, masculinity, and illusion. If the prosecution won, the most powerful figure in professional wrestling could lose everything. The company itself might not survive. And hanging over all of it was a question nobody inside that world wanted asked too loudly. What exactly had been fueling the bodies that built the business? For years, the image had been impossible to ignore. The ring was full of giants, men with impossible shoulders, impossible arms, impossible recovery. They looked less like athletes than comic book drawings dragged into real life. And that was the point. Professional wrestling in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not selling competition. It was selling mythology. It was selling domination. It was selling bodies that looked bigger than fear itself. And at the center of that machine was World Wrestling Federation, a company that had learned how to turn excess into money. The expansion was ruthless. National television, pay-per-view, merchandise, arena tours, Saturday morning visibility. Wrestling was no longer a regional sideshow drifting through smoky civic centers. It had become a polished American export. Bright lights, entrance music, flags, catchphrases, heroes for children, monsters for everyone else. The business was booming because it looked indestructible, but that was the contradiction. The cleaner the product looked on camera, the dirtier the questions became off it, because those bodies were not just large, they were escalating. Season after season, the standard kept moving upward. Bigger chests, thicker necks, more definition, faster recoveries, more pain absorbed, more punishment survived. It was presented as discipline, sacrifice, training, hunger. But behind the pageantry, there was a quiet terror built into the system. In a business where appearance determined opportunity, what happened to the men who could not keep growing? That answer was lurking in locker rooms, hotel rooms, and doctors' offices, long before it ever reached a jury. And then the mood began to shift. America was changing. The culture that once celebrated superhuman size was starting to look at it differently. Sports had already begun to feel the pressure. Scandals around performance enhancement were making headlines. Public trust was thinning. The same country that had once applauded bigger-than-life bodies was starting to ask what those bodies cost and who had helped create them. That was dangerous enough. Then the state stepped in. Not the gossip pages, not a rival promoter, the federal government. Suddenly, this was bigger than wrestling, bigger than tabloid rumor. The case that formed around the company threatened to pull its private logic into public view. Prosecutors were not just circling a few performers. They were looking upward, toward management, toward intent, toward whether the most famous wrestling company in America had not merely benefited from the steroid culture, but quietly depended on it. That changed everything. Because once the question became institutional, every handshake looked different, every transformation looked suspicious, every success story carried a shadow. The larger-than-life product that had conquered television now had to survive something it was never designed for: scrutiny. And there was another twist. The body scandal was not arriving at a time of strength. It was arriving at the precise moment wrestling's image was becoming more vulnerable in other ways. Parents were watching more closely. Sponsors were more cautious. Critics were becoming louder. The business had spent years asking the public to believe in exaggerated heroes, but now that exaggeration itself was starting to look like evidence, the very thing that made the company rich had become a liability. That is when the story stopped being just about chemicals. It became about control. Who controlled the performers? Who controlled access? Who controlled careers? In public, the company projected discipline and order. Behind the curtain, the incentives were harder to see. Wrestlers were independent contractors on paper, but their futures could rise or collapse based on a look, a reaction, a push. Their bodies were their resumes. Their size was leverage. Their decline was punishment. And in a system like that, nobody had to say the quiet part out loud for everyone to understand it. That silence mattered. Because if the pressure was never written down, if the expectation was never formally stated, if the company could benefit without directly ordering anything, then where exactly did responsibility begin? That was the question creeping under the door, and it was worse than a headline because it suggested something colder than a simple scandal. Not chaos, structure, not one reckless decision. A pattern, a culture, maybe even a business model disguised as entertainment. Then one doctor became impossible to ignore. His name pulled the story out of rumor and into paper trails, prescriptions, relationships, access. Suddenly, the issue was no longer abstract. There were records, timelines, links, enough to make investigators believe that the bodies on television were connected to something much more organized behind the scenes. But even then, the deepest danger had not yet surfaced. Because proving that performers used steroids was one thing. Proving that the company's top executive knew, encouraged, or facilitated it, that was something else. And that was where the trial turned lethal. If prosecutors could connect the product in the ring to the decisions in the office, the entire mythology might collapse at once. The patriotic mogul who had sold wrestling as family spectacle could be recast as the architect of a chemically inflated machine. The stars could become witnesses. The company could become an exhibit. The empire could become a crime scene. And once that possibility became real, every loyalist had a choice to make: protect the system or survive it. By the time the government moved in close, the public still did not fully understand what it was looking at. From a distance, it seemed simple. Wrestling had huge men. Some huge men used steroids. A doctor had prescribed them. Prosecutors wanted accountability. That was the visible story. But underneath it, something more unsettling was starting to take shape. Because this was never just about what went into the wrestlers' bodies. It was about what the business had learned to reward. Professional wrestling had always relied on illusion. Winners were chosen. Rivalries were written. Personalities were manufactured. But the bodies, those had to be real. The audience had to believe that part. The veins, the mass, the intimidation, the sheer visual force of it. Even in a scripted industry, the physical presence could not feel fake. It had to overwhelm the eye instantly. And once that visual standard became the engine of ticket sales, television ratings, and merchandise, the pressure stopped being optional. It became structural. No memo had to be sent. No speech had to be given in the middle of the locker room. The message was already there in who got pushed, who got featured, who got posters, who got forgotten. If the company's top stars looked like comic book titans, then everyone below them understood the price of staying ordinary. A wrestler did not need to be ordered to change his body. He only needed to look at the card and see who was winning. That was the genius of the system, and the horror of it, because the pressure could live everywhere while responsibility appeared nowhere. The government began tracing one of the clearest paths into that hidden world through Dr. George Zahorian, a physician whose name would become central to the scandal. He was accused of illegally distributing steroids and other drugs to wrestlers, and when the legal pressure closed around him, the comfortable distance between performer, doctor, and company started to collapse. Investigators did not just see private medical decisions. They saw patterns, recurring relationships, familiar names, a pipeline that seemed too persistent to dismiss as coincidence. And once that pattern became visible, a more dangerous possibility emerged. What if the bodies on screen were not merely individual choices, but the natural output of an environment that quietly demanded enhancement while preserving plausible deniability? That was the line the prosecution wanted to cross. Not just usage, expectation, not just access, normalization, and not just one doctor working on the fringe, but a larger culture that made his role useful. Then came the next rupture. This was not a sports league with a union strong enough to shield its talent. It was not a corporation full of protected employees who could safely report pressure upward. Wrestling existed in a murkier space. The men in the ring were called independent contractors, which gave the company flexibility and gave the performers exposure, but it also created a strange legal and moral fog. They were treated like stars when useful, and like isolated individuals when trouble arrived. If they transformed their bodies, that was personal choice. If the company profited from those transformations, that was business. The line separating coercion from ambition became almost impossible to pin down. And that ambiguity may have been the most important defense of all. Because how do you prosecute a culture? How do you prove that a system compelled behavior without openly commanding it? That question hovered over everything as the case expanded. Witnesses mattered, but so did tone. Records mattered, but so did perception. The prosecution needed jurors to believe that the steroid problem was not incidental to the business. It was entangled with its success. The defense needed the opposite. They needed each wrestler to look like an autonomous adult making private decisions. They needed the company to appear shocked, reforming, responsible. They needed the rot to seem scattered, never central. So even before the courtroom reached its most dramatic moments, the real battle had already begun. It was a battle over narrative. And few people in American entertainment understood narrative better than Vince McMahon. That made the case more dangerous. He was not just another executive facing exposure. He was a man who had built a career on controlling perception, turning weakness into heat, conflict into money, and spectacle into loyalty. He understood how to shape public emotion, how to frame heroes, how to isolate villains, how to survive by deciding what story people were allowed to see. Now, for the first time, he was trapped inside a story he could not fully script. Or maybe not, because just as pressure mounted, the company began presenting signs of reform. Publicly, it moved to distance itself from steroid culture. Drug testing was discussed. Denials hardened. The image began shifting. The company did not want to look like a machine feeding chemically enhanced giants to television audiences. It wanted to look like a business cleaning house before the culture turned completely against it. But that only opened another question. Was it reform or insulation? Was the company genuinely changing because it recognized the danger, or because it knew exactly where the danger was headed? That distinction mattered because jurors were being asked to decide not only what had happened, but what kind of intent had existed behind it. And intent is slippery. People rarely announce it. Systems almost never confess it. By the time a corporation starts acting clean, the dirtiest decisions are often already buried under layers of legal caution and public relations language. Still, the pressure kept building. Former insiders became critical. Testimony loomed. Every conversation carried the possibility of betrayal. Men who had once shared locker rooms, paydays, and private habits were now potential liabilities. Loyalty in wrestling had always been conditional, held together by fear, ambition, and the hope of another push. But legal danger changes the chemistry of loyalty. It makes old silence unstable. It makes memory negotiable. It makes everyone wonder who will talk first. And that was when the case became truly radioactive. Because the company was no longer just fighting the government. It was fighting the possibility that its own mythology could turn against it. The stars who had embodied the product could become proof of what sustained it. The backstage world the audience was never meant to inspect could be dragged into view under oath. And if that happened, the trial would stop being about a few prescriptions and a doctor on the margins. It would become an X-ray of the entire business, not just what fans saw in the ring, but what had been demanded behind the curtain to make any of it believable. And as the trial approached, one question grew heavier than all the others. If everyone knew the look mattered, if everyone knew careers rose and fell on size, if everyone knew where the drugs were coming from, then who exactly was supposed to believe that the man at the top knew nothing? The trial threatened to do something wrestling had spent decades avoiding. It threatened to force the fantasy to answer real questions. Inside the ring, everything was controlled. Pain had timing, rage had choreography, even chaos had structure, but a federal courtroom was different. There, the spectacle could not hide behind entrance music or television lighting. There, the company's private logic had to survive hostile scrutiny, and the deeper prosecutors pushed, the more dangerous the pattern became. Because by then, the issue was no longer whether steroids had touched the business. That was already too obvious. The real question was whether they had been woven into the architecture of success so deeply that removing them would expose the whole system. The government's case aimed directly at that possibility. Prosecutors argued that this was not a random collection of personal mistakes. They argued that the company's chairman had conspired to distribute steroids to performers in order to create and maintain the bodies that define the product. It was a devastating theory because it attacked the company at the level of design, not abuse on the edges, intent at the center. And once that accusation entered the room, every old image changed. Every poster of an impossibly built champion, every handshake backstage, every transformation that happened too fast, every body that seemed to grow beyond reason while the cameras kept rolling as if nothing was unusual. The company had sold power as entertainment. Now power itself was becoming evidence. Then came the witnesses. That was where the case turned unstable. Because legal trials are never just about records and statutes. They are about human beings under pressure. Memory under pressure, loyalty under pressure, fear under pressure. And wrestling, more than most industries, had always run on unstable loyalties. Men were pushed, buried, praised, discarded. Fortunes changed fast. Respect was conditional. Silence was currency, until it stopped paying. Some former performers and insiders became the bridge between the polished public image and the hidden backstage culture. They described an environment where size was not formally ordered, but constantly rewarded. An environment where looking extraordinary was inseparable from surviving professionally. No one needed to shout instructions. The hierarchy did that by itself. The top stars set the template. The booking reinforced it. The cameras glorified it. And everyone else adjusted or disappeared. That was the prosecution's most powerful idea. Not that every act had been commanded. That command had become unnecessary. A system can shape behavior more effectively than an order ever could. It can create a world where the choice is technically free, but the consequences of refusing are obvious. That kind of pressure is harder to prove, but once seen, it is even harder to forget. Still, the case was not moving in only one direction, because the defense understood something crucial. The government needed jurors to see a conspiracy. The defense only needed them to see uncertainty, and uncertainty was everywhere. There were no camera recordings of orders being given, no perfect document with everything spelled out, no neat confession from the top. The line between tolerated behavior and directed behavior remained blurred, and the defense attacked that blur relentlessly. Wrestlers were adults. Wrestlers made choices. Wrestlers sought doctors. Wrestlers managed their own bodies. The company, the defense argued, was being blamed for the private decisions of independent contractors. That argument landed harder than prosecutors wanted, because it drew strength from the very structure that had always protected the business. Wrestling lived in ambiguity. It blurred sport and fiction, employment and independence, performance and reality. That fog had helped the industry thrive. Now it was helping it survive. But one moment cut through the fog more sharply than the rest. Hulk Hogan, the biggest star in the history of the company, the face of its national explosion, the symbol of its muscular morality play, red and yellow heroism, patriotic certainty, a body that looked less like a person than a statement. If anyone could embody the company's old image, it was him. And when he took the stand, the entire case seemed to narrow around his words. Hogan admitted to steroid use. That mattered. A lot. But then he denied that Vince McMahon had directed him to use steroids or supplied them. And, in the logic of the courtroom, that denial hit like a blunt instrument. Prosecutors had hoped that the culture surrounding those bodies would point upward toward the company's center. Instead, the most famous body in the entire machine acknowledged the drug use while stopping short of tying it directly to the man on trial. That was a brutal turn, because it created the worst possible shape for the prosecution's case. The scandal looked real. The culture looked compromised. The bodies looked chemically inflated, but the direct bridge to criminal intent still flickered. And that gap changed the temperature of everything. Suddenly, the trial was not simply about whether steroid use had been widespread. It was about whether the government could transform an obvious moral stain into a provable criminal conspiracy. Those are not the same thing. A jury can believe something ugly happened and still refuse to convict if the chain of proof feels incomplete. That is the terrible strength of ambiguity. It allows systems to remain visibly tainted while legally intact. Then the prosecution made a move that revealed its own desperation. They tried to show that the company's culture itself amounted to pressure from the top, that the body ideal was so extreme, so rewarded, so central to the business, that it effectively functioned as instruction. It was a morally persuasive argument, maybe even historically accurate. But criminal courtrooms are not built to punish atmospheres. They punish actions that can be pinned down, and that is where the entire case began to bend. The deeper truth was becoming visible now, not just about steroids, about power. Power rarely survives because it is innocent. It survives because it knows how to distribute risk downward. The bodies carried the danger. The performers absorbed the damage. The doctors became visible. The company took the profit. And when the legal reckoning finally arrived, responsibility did what it often does in large systems. It became difficult to locate. That was the real exposure. Not simply that wrestling had a steroid problem, but that modern empires are often built to enjoy the benefits of harmful behavior without leaving a clean trail back to the top. The more successful the machine, the more carefully accountability is fragmented. Everyone participates, few control, fewer confess. And yet the trial was still moving toward judgment. The courtroom had heard enough to know the industry was stained, enough to know the bodies were not accidents, enough to know the image sold to millions had been built on something darker than discipline alone. But knowing is not the same as convicting. And just before the final breaking point, the entire future of the company narrowed to one possibility: whether the jury would punish the man at the center of the empire, or prove that the system protecting him had worked exactly as designed. In the end, the empire did not fall in the courtroom. Vince McMahon was acquitted. After weeks of testimony, suspicion, and public humiliation, the jury refused to convict him of conspiracy. The government had shown enough to stain the company's image, enough to expose the steroid culture surrounding professional wrestling, enough to make the entire business look morally compromised, but not enough to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that the man at the top had criminally directed it. That gap saved him. That uncertainty saved the company. And in a way, it revealed the darkest truth in the whole story. A system does not have to be innocent to survive. It only has to be difficult to pin down. The trial had come frighteningly close to destroying World Wrestling Federation. If McMahon had been convicted, the company could have collapsed under legal pressure, financial damage, broadcast fallout, and reputational ruin. The image of family-friendly spectacle had already been ripped open. The giant heroes had been recast as evidence. The patriotic myth had been dragged through a federal case centered on steroids, doctors, and deception. Even in victory, the damage was real. The company did not walk out untouched. It walked out wounded. And then it adapted. That is what powerful institutions do when exposure does not kill them. They mutate. The exaggerated superhero body that had dominated the previous era slowly gave way to something different. The company shifted tone, shifted presentation, shifted rhythm. New stars emerged with different physiques, different styles, different kinds of charisma. Publicly, the old image of chemically inflated invincibility became less useful. The culture moved. The business moved with it. Survival demanded reinvention. But reinvention is not the same as innocence, because the people who paid the deepest price were never the executives in suits. They were the performers whose bodies had become the battlefield. Men who lived inside a system that rewarded extremity, monetized damage, and blurred the line between ambition and self-destruction. Some gained fame. Some gained short-term security. Some gained a place in wrestling history. But many absorbed the physical and psychological cost in silence long after the lights went dark. That is the part these scandals always try to hide. The profit rises to the top, the risk sinks to the bottom. McMahon kept control. The company endured. In time, it would evolve into something even larger than before, a machine that had stared at possible extinction and survived long enough to rewrite its own legacy. That may be the most unsettling ending of all. Not that the scandal happened, not that the culture was exposed, but that exposure itself was not enough to break the structure that produced it. Because this story was never only about steroids. It was about incentives, about plausible deniability, about what happens when a business quietly rewards a result it never wants to openly request, about how power protects itself by turning systemic pressure into individual choice, and about how institutions often escape not by disproving the rot, but by making the rot too diffuse to prosecute cleanly. That is why the trial still matters, not just as wrestling history, as a warning. Whenever an industry sells perfection, superhuman performance, impossible growth, or relentless dominance, the same question returns. What hidden cost is being buried underneath the image? Who is being pushed to absorb it? And when the reckoning comes, who will actually be left holding the blame? The names change, the business changes, the bodies change, the logic rarely does. To understand the future of money, we must first understand its past. Subscribe to uncover the truth.